Last month, which is the month of March, the International Women's Day was observed across the world, with the global community recommitting themselves to ensure gender parity and bridge the gap that's breaking away the bias that affect African women on a daily basis. However, there is still work to be done in a bid to ensure that women's rights are treated as human rights. In this edition of In-Depth, we shall be looking at some of the challenges women are facing, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, and some of the solutions that could be brought forth to make the woman powerful and gain her place in the society. Stay with us. My guest has over 15 years of professional experience in gender advocacy as well as campaigning on a wide range of issues, including human rights and rights-based programming, development, human security, conflict, policy, as well as international relations. She studied communication and international relations at the University of Indianapolis in the United States of America, and she also holds a degree in diplomacy and political strategies at the Centre d'études diplomatiques et stratégiques de Paris. She is fluent in English, French, Portuguese, as well as Dioula. She hails from Burkina Faso and has worked for more than 35 countries in 4 continents. She is the founder and chief executive officer of NIEL, which is a campaigning and advocacy group which has worked across Africa. She's also covered women issues as well as worked on political programs for presidential campaigns in Burkina Faso, her native country, as well as other parts of Africa. Join me to welcome Valerie Traore, the Chief Executive Officer and founder of NIEL. Valerie Traore, it's a pleasure having you on In-Depth. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, the pleasure is shared. We all know that last month, the month of March, was observed as the International Women's Day. When you look at what has been done last month, what appraisal can you give about how women observe the day, particularly across the African continent?
This is a great question, Peter. But one of the ways in which I'd like to rephrase it is, why is it that it's women that have to observe International Women's Day? It's a day of a recognition of the advances of women's rights as a greater half of the population. So it's a celebration that everybody should participate in. So women do observe it, and women have observed it as they have over year after year after year. But it shouldn't be a question of how women are celebrating or how women are observing International Women's Day, but how the world in its entirety, it is actually checking itself, wondering what advances we have made in regards to women's rights, but also celebrating women.
Yeah, you just mentioned that it's not all about the International Women's Day, but when we look at what has been achieved so far, particularly around the theme of this year, do you have the feeling that the other gender, that's the men, are also, coming around to see how they can give women the necessary push that is being called for on a daily basis?
I think some of that is happening, but I definitely think far, far less than what is enough. It's just, once we understand that women's rights are human rights, and I think this is where the conversation needs to be anchored. Just as an example, I'll give you, Peter. It's not children that have to fight for children's rights alone. Everybody does focus on that. It's not people of a certain, when something happens, it's not people of a certain group, of a certain ethnicity, that are the only ones that are supposed to see where injustices happen and where people are not living and fulfilling the same rights as others. So this is a collective struggle. It's a collective battle that should be by men, women, younger, older, regardless of background. It's a fight. And I think the same way that I, as a woman, would give my time to support other rights, all human rights, is the same way that everybody, regardless of their gender, should be able to support women's rights as well. I don't think I think some of that you see in many instances where, and because of the work of a lot of organizations and a lot of governments, that this is now seen as something that men should engage in. So you see a lot of progress with that, but that is definitely not sufficient. even as today, when we speak about women's rights, is seen as a women celebrating Women's International Women's Day. That to me is a testament to how much of a way we still have to go.
Now, but don't you see that if the other gender, that's the men, are not coming as expected, is because the women have appropriated that the International Women's Day is all about them, and that sort of like keep the men away from, carrying out the cause of women. Does that not play a role?
What do you mean have appropriated? Please explain what you mean by women have appropriated that day.
Well, during Women's Day, I would like to give you the case in my country, Cameroon. During Women's Day, the women, most of the shared belief is that the women say it's their day, it's a day when they need to, showcase themselves, showcase their potentials, and that of like, attention is not being focused on the fact that the men also have to come on board to see how they can push the women to get to where they are expected to be.
There are two parts. There's a two-part answer to that. The first part is, why do we have an International Women's Month in the first place? Is because most of the rest of the 11 months of the year are not done in celebration of women or in celebration of the achievements of women, or even in recognition of the struggles and the discriminatory practices that still affect women. So it is the only month in the year that is actually focused on specifically looking at how far do we have to go. So it is normal that that month focusing on it because of the discriminatory practices that happened the rest of the year and that have happened 4 centuries to bringing us where we are today. So obviously I stand by the fact that that month should really be about women's rights, not just a celebration, but also an acknowledgement of the work that is still yet to be done. So that's the one piece answer to that, where I agree with you that the focus is on women's rights, and I do think that it should be on women's rights, because the rest of the year, unfortunately, it's not as it should be. But the second part of the answer to that is, as a support, as an ally to women's rights, it's not up to women to make it comfortable for men to come in. An ally sees injustices in the world. An ally sees injustice in their space, and they step in to help. If we now turn International Women's Month to be about how men are supporting and make it exclusively about men again, we are again shifting the purpose of that month. It should be an allyship where we come together and work together. It's not about my month versus your month, but it's about, this is a time to celebrate achievements, but also it's time to recognize how far we have to go about women's rights. It's not necessarily to look at and to highlight the role of men within that, where they are participating as ally in supporting of a cause that is relevant and important for all of them. No man here is in this world without a woman, and this is a partnership that should be looked at in that way, and men have to step up. To say that it's women who are pulling it back is oftentimes the one who has been discriminated against has to fight harder, so they have to step up. Not to say that stepping up for women means excluding men. How are men stepping up for themselves and for the women in their lives during that time? Because women's rights is actually improving men's lives.
All right. Now, in a recent publication, Valerie, you mentioned that there's still a whole lot of work to be done in a bit to bridge the gender gap. And you made this particular statement that women's rights are also human rights. When you look at the situation, the plight of the African woman in particular, how disturbed are you by this gender gap which is existing?
Of course, I'm distraught. I live every day as a woman. It is who I am. And what that means is every day you are not sure how, what level of abuse you will see, what level of discrimination you will face. Every day you see one of the biggest things of this year's theme was Break the Bias. And the biases around women and women's rights are abundant, are everywhere. They're in the media, and that particular article I called on seriously around the media, both social and traditional media, to what biases they're putting around women's rights, but also around the role of women, the position of women, and the decision-making agency of women within our world. one of the things that makes me distraught is that despite the fact that I see these biases in my everyday world, Peter, I am not the one that is the hardest hit by that because I have resources, because I have access, because I have had access to education. I am of the privileged few amongst women. But yet, despite that, I still feel some of these discrimination practices. I still feel when I walk into the room how I'm treated. I still walk around in the evening with fear that something is going to happen to me. But yet, I'm not the one that is most at risk. I'm not the one that is struggling to have access to education. And I'm very conscious of this privilege that I have today and that I've had growing up. So, yes, I'm distraught. I'm distraught because 52% of the population is living in conditions that are inhumane. And that is as because they're women. Now, there are different factors. You take class factors, you take where they live that impede that. And I'm not saying that men or young boys are not seeing some factors of discrimination depending on who they are and where they live and what some of their backgrounds are. But I'm just saying that we're looking at literally half of the world's population that keeps on saying it is not right. It is not about equality, it's about equity. It's about being able to have access to the same rights and the same opportunity as anybody else.
Now, since the start of the chat, Valerie, you have been mentioning some of these inequalities. Can we get practical examples so that we make our viewers clear on some of these issues? Because sometimes some of the women may be going through some of these abuses without them even being aware of. Look at let's take your case for example. You say you do not really feel it like the rural women or the women who are in the hinterlands. But what are the challenges that you do face on a daily basis?
The challenges that I do face on a daily basis are challenges, for example, of security, right? You say that violence is abundant in depending on where you go. One of the things that I have to be very conscious of is walking around in the evening by myself. This is just a very simple example because I have to be conscious that at any point there could be an attack on my person. That is one challenge, and that's a very real challenge that most women face. If you look at the fact that statistically, and I think about 1 in 3 women around the world has had some sort of abuse or assault or attempted or has to face some sort of harassment in her life, it is significant, it is current, it is rampant, and that is actually regardless of her social status or where she lives. And that's a third of most women around the world. So that is a thing that regardless of where I am, I still face those same issues. I started a business 14 years ago. I run an agency. I have team, I have staff. Walking into a rooms that are predominantly men, sometimes your ideas are not taken into consideration. I don't necessarily take that to heart. And I have learned and I've been fine enough to push my way around the industry in which I operate and still be able to push the boundaries regardless of the issues that I'm working with, whether it's women's rights, access to sanitation, access to health or education. That's something that I hold to my heart, and even in governance. But that is something that very clearly you're reminded every day that sometimes your place is not in that room. And that's something I face. I don't want to name names necessarily, but that's something that I face every day.
All right, Valerie, you're joining us from Dakar, Senegal, where we know the political climate is very peaceful compared to the neighboring countries. We are talking about Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, which have just experienced coup d'etats. When you look at the backslide in democracy around West Africa, where does this keep the woman? Where is the place of the woman? Do you think that the backslide in democracy has instead worsened some of these problems which the women are facing?
Backslide of democracy makes everything worse. Backslide of democracy makes us go back into basic human rights, and it's the same for women as it is for men. For the entire country, I'm from Burkina Faso, and nobody likes a coup d'etat. Nobody also likes a challenging security situation. When you have a country that is going through a security challenge, that is going through difficulties that are very, very complex issues, access to education becomes difficult for everybody. And as you know, the first person that are sacrificed from access to education are girls. Access to water and healthy living conditions become difficult for everybody. And you know the people that are most danger to being vulnerable to these situations are young women and girls. You know that access to foodstuff and farming becomes very difficult in areas where the general income drops. and women are responsible still for feeding their families, regardless of where the men are and how they're operating within that family. So obviously, the backlash of democracy affects everybody, and slowing down in development affects women at a disproportionate rate. Having said that, what I will also say is one of your questions: where's the place of women? And our place is everywhere. Again, if we just simply by the fact that women's rights are human rights, and I will hammer that point again and again, that women's rights are human rights, but also a woman is half, if not more, than the population. How can there be a decision about half of the population without that population in the room? How can one decide on a woman's body for a woman without that woman having the agency and the conversation about what that means? How can one decide around a woman's political action where for her without her having had the space of stepping into that? Women are making their way, so it's not about men opening the door only. Women have been fighting. Women's movements around this continent have been really strong. So I also don't want to give the impression that this is a struggle that somehow women are not fighting. They're fighting it every day. They're fighting every day, despite some of the statements. I mean, you have heard when a woman is fighting for women's rights, it's said to be, oh, she's trying to be difficult, she's trying to be this. No, we are here today. I am standing in front of you doing this interview today because generations and generations and generations of women have pushed the boundaries to allow me the space to be here.
Now, you just spoke a moment ago about the role decision-making can play and how women must get to that decision table. Now, in concrete terms, how beneficial is it for these women to go onto the places where these decisions are being taken? You just mentioned moments ago that they constitute more than 50% of the entire population, and it's very normal for decisions to be taken when they are there. So how necessary is it for them to start aspiring for those decision-making positions?
It is crucial. It is crucial for them to aspire to this position. It is crucial for them to make space to get access to this position. One of the work that we do is around women's political engagement, but not only that, and just political engagement to improve democracy on the continent. It's definitely something that we do. Being in the room is important to bring your point of view and to bring your lived experience as well as your professional experience. You would not think of deciding agricultural policy without people that understand agriculture in the room. You would not think to define oil and gas and mining policy without people that understand oil, mining, and gas. But somehow, this is how decision-making is done when it comes to women's rights or even the youth, right? People that tend to be in the room to decide around youth policy tend to be old guards in our countries, and that is also unacceptable, in my opinion. But the way in which women have to take part in that process is going to be one of the things that's going to open doors for greater, more inclusive decision-making. Now, this should also take into consideration some of the barriers to women accessing political positions. You're not without knowing, Peter, that the moment you see a woman in politics, the name calling begins. Somehow she's not competent. She is judged by harsher and different standards than the men in the same position. The mistakes she makes are highlighted by 1,000, whereas those mistakes by men will be seen as just the mistake of a man. So I think we also, again, when we talk about the theme for International Women's Month last month, breaking the bias, we also have to break the bias by which the standards we use to judge women in political spaces, in policy-making spaces, in decision-making spaces, that will allow for a greater number of women to feel comfortable entering that space.
Do you think that some of these misjudgments about the woman is what is shying these women from getting to the top decision-making positions? Do you strongly believe that that's only the reason, or there are some other factors which limit the women from getting across to the decision-making positions?
Oh, there are many factors. This is definitely not the only factor. There are many factors that keep women from entering decision-making powers. You are not without knowing that there is definitely impediments. So when a woman has to bear the biggest burden of taking care of her family, this is even in business. It's not just even in business, in work and profession, not just in political spaces, right? Women are being judged for taking time off to have a family, well, men don't have the same impediments to have to take time off to take care of the families. When she does, the judgment that comes upon and her ability to continue to career is limited in that sense. The responsibility of taking care of the household fall exceedingly, and don't quote me on it, but I feel like the numbers around 80% fall on the woman's shoulders. So to have even the freedom to be able to have the time and enter policymaking spaces is limited by nature for a woman. Secondly, education that allows women to enter these spaces and to be, you look at movements, student movements, there's quite a lot of women, but it's increasingly, it's disproportionately male. So even the spaces at the youth level, at the student level, that allow for greater women to practice and to participate in decision making before we get to the legislative, before we get to the city, before we get to that level, is highly dominated by men. But yet, when the men go and ask for votes, who did they ask for votes for? Women,
From the
because
women, of
they're
course.
also the majority of people that vote.
Yeah. Now, when you look at all these difficulties and with your experience in several campaigns, both social and political, where women are involved, how should women navigate through this, this puzzle to get themselves to the top?
Women are navigating. I think one of the things is to have a choice. It requires a lot more strength, energy, battle, and fight for women to navigate, and courage to navigate those spaces. I think I would encourage women to do so. I would also encourage people to encourage their younger girls to see leadership in them and to give them space to allow them to be leaders. When a girl speaks, more than not, she will be told it's not your place to speak. So how do we encourage younger people to find value in stepping up in roles of leadership? That's where it starts. It's not when the woman is in her 40s, 50s that she then develops the desire to lead or the desire to serve, or to be that voice. So I would say that it happens as we educate our girls, as we educate our young girls, that we open their eyes and we open that door to their ability to continue to lead in different sectors. And I will say again, not just in politics. And I think that that's something that is useful. I will say in terms of training that this is also important, that we're investing as women, but also as men and everybody, in training of a general mindset of activism as well as of political engagement. One of the other things that might be a deterrent factor, and I'm not saying it's the only one, or that is a deterrent factor for most women, is again, even men will say this, how dirty politics can be. And that is a thing that women don't want to put themselves through that position. And given the battles that happen there, might want to steer away. So again, these are some examples. I don't want to send the message that these are the only reasons that is keeping them, but also look at how political movements are structured. You have a leadership that is entirely male, and then you have a women's wing that is completely separate from the main leadership. What does that do? It doesn't allow for this growth. It doesn't allow for this seeing how women can really truly participate in decision making, first of all, of the party before it even gets to elections.
Now, if you were to advise various governments, we all know that across Africa, there's always a ministry either in charge of the family, which takes care of women issues, or you have another ministry solely in charge of the women and children, or some sort of that framework. If you were to advise the governments, what major counsel will you give to them in a bid to ensure that women's rights are treated as human rights and they get empowered as they should?
I would actually say, do you want your country to develop faster, to develop stronger? And by doing that, look at the competency. I celebrate when I see governments that have the audacity and that dare to open their eyes and to have women as ministers of justice, women as ministers of finance and the economy, women as ministers of defense, not just relegated to the women's ministry or the social affairs ministry, because this is not where those decisions happen. Defense affects women. Energy affects women. Justice affects women. So again, it's not everything else is done that doesn't think of women. And then we have this one ministry that addresses women's rights. Women's rights are everywhere. The Ministry of Agriculture affects women. The Ministry of Water and Sanitation affects women. So that's where I would say, think about how you're making decision and ensuring that your entire government is truly representative of what your country looks like. If your country is 50% women or 52% women or is majority women, then your government should reflect that. If your country is youth oriented, then your government should actually reflect that. Your government should reflect the diversity of ethnicities, of religions, of backgrounds that is in the country. You cannot just sit and say, we will have a homogeneous government that looks only at that way. And then to accommodate for these other groups, we will have other ministries that will just focus on them. That would be the advice I would give, because in all of those sectors, again, whatever it is, be it defense or digital or IT, they're as brilliant women as they are brilliant men.
All right, now, Valerie, I would like us to look at a very important aspect of the woman, which of course is sanitation and the decision that goes alongside that. We have observed that across the African continent, women are not involved in sanitation decisions. How terribly bad can that be for the woman first and society at large?
Hugely. When I'll broaden it from sanitation to wash in general, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene.
Yeah.
So you know that women bear the biggest brunt of gathering water. Still, they're the ones that have to use the water for cooking, for cleaning, for washing. But yet, how water is distributed and the cost and the process by which the water comes does not, for the most part, does not necessarily include women. It is not inclusive. When you think about sanitation, access to toilets, where again, as much as we've been doing a great amount of work over the years on reducing open defecation around the continent, access to toilets to be able to cater to their needs in dignity and in privacy is huge and affects women more so than it does affect men. Also, when we talk about hygiene, we're talking about women's menstruation and how access, again, to safely manage sanitation is hugely important for women. So when you put that, it is a crucial sector for women, for women's rights, for women's dignity, and for women's lives. At the same time, poorly managed sanitation actually affects health. We know that affects the health of the family, affects the health of the children, and affects the health of the girl. So it is important, I cannot stress it enough, that a process that is so determinant to the everyday life of a woman include her experience and is actually grounded on her experience as a basis for making decisions about how that is, the policies are being developed, the investments are being made around that. So to answer your question, I couldn't think of more importance for women to be not just included, but at the center of decision making that defines WASH policy and WASH services in our countries.
Now, in as much as the women have to be at the center, like you mentioned, what role can the men play? Because from an open perspective, it's always seen as the woman's business. Do you think men and society at large can help advance this particular policy?
Men also eat. Men also use the bathroom. Men also need to use water. Men also need to drink water, to bathe. It is not, again, I don't want to send the message that this is a women's issue, but it affects women disproportionately because they carry the greatest burden of gathering, of cleaning, of taking care of the household as well as their families. So it is, as long as you drink and you eat, sanitation is your problem. It's just as simple as that, right? And if it is your problem, and if you're going to define policies on how to do it, one, it makes sense to define policy that actually serve everyone, that serve everybody, that your entire family as a man and your entire family includes the women in your life are able to use safely managed sanitation services at their household level. I think this is just a simple way of saying, how do I make sure we as a community, everybody is catered for in the way that works for them? So something simple. Have you ever thought about how a pregnant woman uses a latrine, for example, and the discomfort that that is for her? Or how, when there is no safe toilet around the space and women have at night to go out of the compound and out of the household to go use the bathroom because there's no toilet in the vicinity, her safety is at stake. So as much as this is a man thing, it is just as essential because it is, if we don't center it around the women's experience, there's a lot of things that we're missing. I'm not saying not to take into account the men experience, but there are a lot of factors that are particular to women that we're missing if we don't make sure that sanitation is anchored on that experience.
Now, for many years, you have been involved in this campaign. When you look at the response so far from governments and international partners, how will you rate it? How will you rate the response towards the WASH initiative?
It's actually been encouraging. I will have to say it varies from country to country, but it's been encouraging. We have worked with a few ministries, and we see that the ministry at the directorate level are very much willing. They're looking for solutions. What you'll see with sanitation is many of our cities were actually not sewered, and the growth of our cities happened with non-sewer sanitation, as you know, non-collective. So, and what that means is the governments are having to catch up and put systems in place. Many of our cities do not have treatment plants, do not have a very clear value chain of sanitation. But we've seen quite a lot of interest. We've seen progress. You may know that AMCAO, which is a ministerial association at the AU level that brings together ministers, sectoral ministers of water and sanitation, just last year issued the Africa Sanitation Policy Guidelines, which are guidelines to help governments to look at their own policy in light of the ASPG and see, are we being inclusive enough? Are we being transparent enough? Are we using these same templates to make sure that our policy are aligned and are actually inclusive of everyone's rights, of women's rights, of men's rights, of people with disabilities, of different factors that are important to sanitation to include in the value chain. One of the other encouraging factors, and we've worked with them for a few years, is to seeing how parliamentarians are also taking this very seriously. And a few of them have created a African Parliamentary Network for Water and Sanitation and Hygiene. That now the president has been taken by one parliamentarian from Senegal, Mr. Toussaint Manga, Honorable, who is taking the leadership with his peers into making sure that that question is really looked at in Parliament and gets to get the attention of government as it should. So there is definitely, it's encouraging to see that it's starting to be a focus where in the past, water is hugely important, but you cannot just think of water without sanitation, because one of the things that's important to note is sanitation is one of the biggest users of water. If you flush the toilet, look at how much water you are actually using. So both really go hand in hand.
All right, now let's delve into one aspect which will interest you. We are talking about activism. Over the years, we have seen more women going into frontline as well as online activism. What will you say is the value of this form of activism for the woman and society at large?
Women do what women have to get heard. Everybody does what they have to do to get heard. And there is, again, this depending on where, it depends on how, but there's enough is enough sentiment that is growing, that has grown. You see a lot greater connection across the continent, and social media has helped with that, has helped increase activism on an online platform, but also has helped create networks that improve activism on offline within cities, within countries, as well as across the continent. I wouldn't say the value, because I think all action and all tactics are valuable to the extent that they are targeted to the particular issue at the particular moment in the particular country. So the value in this case, it might be valuable. In that other case, it might be valuable. But I do think it speaks to a sentiment of we've had enough. And whenever I see that, to me, that is a very clear sense that we're not being heard where we should be heard. And there is a necessity for a group of women, for a majority of women, to speak up and to continue the battle that our mothers and our grandmothers have been engaging with for decades.
Now, this leads me to this popular view about feminism, which of course is part of the activism which women are carrying out. Now, across the African continent, it is popularly believed that the feminists, those that are instead working against the woman, because they preach doctrines which goes against women's empowerment, even though they claim to be fighting for the woman. What can you say about that?
I'll return the same question to you, Peter, if you allow me to, because are you talking about feminism, or are you talking about specific groups? And what is the argument against? Because I feel like that debate gets to be So let me ask you, what are we talking about when we're talking about feminism?
Well, you have a group of women who say they are feminists, they defend women's rights, but at the end of the day, the society tend to, tell them that what you're defending works against the woman because it makes the woman be at war with society rather than empowering the woman. That's the general perception about it. Do you think it's a
Yeah.
misconception about feminism in Africa?
Feminism is simply believing that women has have the right to are human. Let me start there. Are human, fully human, have the right to live fully and have access to the same opportunities as anybody else on this planet. If you believe that women have the same rights of all human rights, whatever they are, and I will hold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a standard here, then you are a feminist. Now, having said that, different groups will go at the battle differently. So, having said that, I'll also probably say that I am a feminist because I believe in our human rights. I believe in my human rights. I believe in my fellow women's human rights. And I believe in everybody's human rights. I believe that we should have the same opportunities as everybody else. That is feminism. That's the plain definition of feminism. Now, when people don't like that language, they tend to turn it around and try to blame the messenger and highlight some weaknesses in maybe this one person's argument or other, and then turn it around to say the feminists are the problem. But the question is, do we agree in the principles of feminism? I don't want to get into a discussion around this group is doing this way, this group is doing this that way, this group, because I'm not a judge to how different women's organizations are fighting for what they want to push. However, the bottom line is when people are saying women's groups are hindering women's rights by putting them against society, are we questioning how society is holding women's rights down? We stop questioning that and then now put the blame on the women that are fighting back. So the argument that they shouldn't fight back and they should wait while society tells them every day in one way or the other that they're either not enough or that they're not sufficient, that they're not in their rightful places. So for me, that is almost a non-debate. The key question is, do I believe in feminism as a basic understanding that we all have the same rights and that we should all be afforded the same opportunity to live in dignity and to thrive? The answer to that for me is yes. Based on that, am I a feminist? Absolutely. Are there ways in which different groups behave that I agree with and others I do not agree with? Absolutely. The same way I will see any other struggle for any other right and say, I don't agree with how that group is doing it. And I agree with how this group is doing it. Or, ooh, I wouldn't have taken the strategy. I wouldn't have spoken it that way. But I don't take one organization's approach or two organizations' approach and blankets and speak to the entire rights of the people it's defending as being somehow wrong. I hope that that answers your question.
Yeah.
But it is something that is being put out there, but I feel like this is to some extent a non-debate because it takes us away from the true question of do we have the same rights and should we be afforded the same opportunities?
Yeah, that's perfectly understood. Now, we see women pushing on all fronts in the economic, social, political fronts, carrying campaigns here and there. Do you think that women should be fighting on all fronts at the same time, or they should carry a course when they achieve it and then move to the next one? Do you think what should be the proper way for women to carry out their course?
You were breaking a little bit, so I'm not sure I got that right. But I think you're asking if women should be pushing on all fronts.
Yeah, of course.
The thing I would say to that is women are not one homogeneous group. So it's should men be pushing on all fronts? Should men be fighting to achieve economic success and health success and access to education success? Women are not one homogeneous group. So if my personal struggle, me Valerie, is women's rights around economic justice, then that's where I'm going to fight as a contribution to the overall women's rights movement. If another group is fighting for women's bodily autonomy, then that is their contribution. And I will support that, although that may not be my primary area of engagement. But all fronts, as long as there are fronts where we are not treated in a way that affords us, again, the same opportunities to thrive and live in dignity and feel safe, then that is a front that is worth fighting. For example, you're in Cameroon. What might be the key issue for women's farmers in Cameroon that are working on specifically, I don't know, coffee or some other thing, may not be the same issue that are the current struggle of women in urban Harare that are dealing with something related at that particular moment to gender-based violence. And even within the same space, a group of women maybe experiences gender-based violence, maybe experiencing lack of access to economic opportunities, maybe experiencing the fact that one of their daughters was kicked out of school for being on her period because she didn't have a bathroom. At what point do we say one is not important? Whoever is carrying that torch and fighting for that fight out, that issue is hugely important to her own life, her own security, and her own livelihood. So we have to allow for the diversity of issues that are all women's issues, because at the same time, when we look at all fronts that the whole world is fighting from, we don't say, let's stop talking about health, let's just focus on education. We don't say, let's stop talking about education, let's only talk about food from a general world perspective. So why should women's battle be only limited to one of those areas when all of those areas affect us?
All right, before we go, just this one question. The theme of this year's International Women's Day is calling on the women to break the gender gap and, face the challenges. Just your one last word before you go. What would be that final advice you give to African women as they have moved on from the International Women's Day? We are now in April. Last month was the month of March. What advice will you give them?
I would ask your permission to not just give advice to women, but to give advice to all of us.
Yeah.
And that is the theme around breaking the bias. We all walk around every day with our own biases. Biases around what feminism is, biases around, oh, look at this woman, how can she live alone? Biases around what is she wearing? Biases around why is she talking like she's the boss of me? Biases around from women themselves. Imposter syndrome, I don't have my place here. Biases around what are other people going to think? I would say if there's anything that we can do for ourselves and for everybody else is to check when you have those thoughts about women this, women that, my place at women, to pause, to ask yourself, am I really looking at this from a human perspective and not a gender lens only? The gender lens is important if it's a lens that encourages openness and inclusivity. But if it's about judging and closing the door, then that should be something that we check. So for me, for the rest of the year, is check yourselves, because I'm checking myself, and I hope that everybody listening and watching your show is going to ask themselves that question. Nobody is beyond bias. Nobody is saying that I do not judge. Nobody doesn't have a filter. But once we recognize that we do have those biases, what do? It's one step at a time. Every time you have that one thought, that one question, stop yourself and ask myself, am I really doing humanity and human rights a service?
All right, thank you very much, Valerie Traore. It was a massive pleasure to have you here on In-Depth on Dash News, and good luck with what you're doing with Niel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for hosting me. It's been a great conversation, and all the best to you as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And to you, televiewers, that was how we saw the program In Depth today. Until next time, bye-bye.